societal revolution. And this fellow, Martin Luther, the Reformation, Bible printed in German, not in Latin, so it was accessible to everyone. This is, we sort of think of it as the democratization of information. It used to be that only the very elite in organization, now everyone can do it. And this, of course, created the Reformation, the Enlightenment, everything was great. And so, that's the end of the story. It was a wonderful, wonderful time. Well, actually, it wasn't quite so wonderful, because the Reformation led to lots of conflict. This was and not all of the information that was published was the Bible. There was a lot of propaganda published. This was Luther's propaganda against the Pope. This is the Whore of Babylon. By the way, Luther's graphic designer was a fellow by the name of Lucas Cranach. Maybe some of you have heard of him. A very famous artist from that era. But it was printed. There weren't any words here, but it was printed, and that had this extra credibility with the public because it was from this hot new technology. So all hot new technologies have this sort of additional credibility with the public. Radio, TV. When they first start, everybody thinks, if it's on radio, it must be true. I'm sure you've heard that. If it's on the internet, it must be true. Why? Well, because it's new. It's just this seduction of the new. Anyway, this in turn led to quite a bit of disruption in the world. There was the peasants' revolt in the early 16th century. Several 100,000 people died. Partially because of the printing press, because of this revolution, this social revolution. The 30 Years' War. This is the great American writer, commentator Mark Twain, and he wrote this on the 500th anniversary of the invention of the printing press. Gutenberg's achievement created a new and wonderful earth, but at the same time also a new hell. During the past 500 years, Gutenberg's invention has supplied both earth and hell with new occurrences, new wonders, and new phases. And this is my favorite quote. It found truth astir on earth and gave it wings. But untruth was also abroad, and it was supplied with a double pair of wings. A lie moves much faster than the truth. Why? We can all come up with our own ideas. It's funnier, it's easier, it's more entertaining, whatever it is. But when you speed the flow of information, yes, you speed the flow of accurate information, but it turns out that you more than compensate for that by increasing the flow of misinformation. And we see that every day. We see that every day on social media where something that's inaccurate moves much faster than the truth or the retraction or anything else. So this is all by way of saying human beings, civilization, we've been through these issues before. And I'm not going to go into much of what is going on now. You're all familiar with the Facebook issues, Twitter, Google, all the algorithms, the fake posts, so forth. But remember, and some of you are old enough to remember, 25 years ago, when the internet first was being launched, there was this guy, Tim Berners-Lee. Any of you know who Tim Berners-Lee was? He invented the web. Mm. The internet existed, but he created that, that we now attribute to the web. And he and all of his buddies, they thought they were saving the world. They thought, you can go back and read the quotes, this is going to change mankind. We're now going to be able to create the world that we really want and really deserve. And maybe that's what we've done. We've created this world, whether we want it, we certainly deserve it because we're all part of doing it, which is one of the main lessons of this course. We're all responsible for everything that's on the web in our own ways. Anyway, so this is all by way of introduction. So when we think about news literacy, we want to address 4 challenges that we think this new digital era have presented to consumers. I'm sorry, it's a little hard to see that first one there, but it's speed versus accuracy. Journalists have always had a tension between being first and being right. Your boss, your editors are always saying, "Where's that story? Come on, we know how many people died. Who got elected? What's going on here?" And the editor, the reporter is always saying, "Oh, wait a second, Well, nowadays it's instantaneous because, in spite of the fact that most people, when asked, will say, "We want the news to be right, not first." If you pick up your smartphone and you go to your news website and you want to know how many children in Thailand have been rescued from the sky, and you go to the New York Times and they say, "Well, we don't know, it's unclear." Well, you don't sit there and I'll just wait for the New York Times to tell me. You then go to some other website, and you keep going until somebody tells you what the answer is. You demand that the second challenge is, as you may remember, I mentioned something about the exponential growth of Gutenberg. Well, I don't know what exponential is, but that's what we have now. We all know the statistics. So many hundreds, thousands of hours, millions of hours of videos are uploaded to YouTube every day. So in many ways, it's like the best of times and the worst of times. It's very easy to go out and find information that you never could have found a zillion years ago. Boreana last night was talking about how she goes and buys foreign newspapers, and when I was a reporter for Time magazine here in Poland in 1981, 82, 83. To get a copy of the Herald Tribune back then. Now, you get paper from anywhere in the world, get it translated. It's amazing. It's the best of times. But it's the worst of times, too, because there's so much information. How do you figure out what it is you're going to look for? Of all the stuff that's offered, what do you choose? Where do you stop? Where do you start? So we're simply overwhelmed, and that causes people to do lots of things. So largely, it causes them to migrate towards certain websites, places that will give them a view of the world that they find comfortable, or it causes them to shut down. Just I'm just overwhelmed. I'm just not going to do anything. So the third challenge is what we call blurring of the lines. Think of this as the challenge of authenticity. So it's about 40 years ago in New York, a group of journalists every year or so would get together, and as a joke, they would produce a fake edition of the New York Times. It would take them months. They would have it properly typeset. It cost a lot of money. And it was very funny, but it really looked like the New York Times. If you didn't know that it was a satire. Well, my students can make a fake New York Times article in about 15 minutes. Everybody can do fakes now. How do you tell what's authentic from what's not authentic? In terms of native advertising, all of these euphemisms, many reputable news sites will show you advertising that looks just like it's a real newspaper story, a real journalism story. And mean, they'll told our readers that this isn't really news, that this is, no, 90% of consumers don't know that that means that it's not. Because nobody actually clicks on a real ad anymore, right? And probably the most daunting challenge is right here, between our 2 ears. It's us. Why is it us? What's the biggest challenge we face? Consuming information.
You're right. You think we know what the...
Yeah. We're smart people. You know what's real, not real. And that thought is only half of the problem. The other half is that we don't even know we're doing it. We have these implicit biases. And eventually, over time, you wind up seeking out news sources that make you feel better. It confirms what you already think, so it must be right. I knew I was so smart. And we avoid information that conflicts with that, because it actually does. This is Feistinger came up with this term, cognitive dissonance, about 30 or 40 years ago. Anyway, Festinger, sorry. Cognitive dissonance. It basically means it's very difficult or even painful to hold conflicting thoughts at the same time. And so your brain is always trying to avoid this pleasant feeling of being confronted with information that conflicts with what you know to be right. So, if you're a Trump supporter in the United States, you watch Fox News because they'll always tell you that Trump is great. And if you hate Trump, you watch MSNBC and they'll tell you you're right, he's an idiot. And you watch MSNBC all the time, you never watch Fox. And I guess here in Poland, now it's like TVN, if you don't like the government, and public TV if you do like the government.
Right.
So, and we all think, oh, I'm not biased. I'm smart enough to, but we're not. And what's worse, if you combine this with information overload, like where do you stop? Where do you choose? How do you choose your algorithms? Give us our news feeds. If you're on Facebook, if you're on Google News, Apple News, any of these things, they arrange the news based on your previous searches. And so eventually, over time, all you get is information that agrees with your point of view, because what's the last thing Google or Facebook or any of these any of these websites, any of these social media platforms, what's the last thing they want you to do?
Stop using it?
Yeah, leave.
Leave.
If I start showing you stuff that, makes you feel, cognitive dissonance, you're but I don't need this. I'm going to go, Facebook's whole business model is based on keeping you there, showing you what you want to see. And I don't care how often Mark Zuckerberg testifies that they're changing that, or that they're working on the algorithms or the artificial, it's baloney, because that is their business model. Google is there to give you what you want. YouTube, he takes it a step further. If you watch a Donald Trump video of him speaking about immigration, you know how YouTube queues up, so the next video after that, so you search for that. The next video that they offer you is by someone who is slightly even more anti-immigrant than Trump. And the next one after that is more so. They upsell you ideologically. They don't, Google doesn't, actually do this, it has, but that's the way the algorithms are built, because that then sucks you in. So pretty soon, you're watching a video done by somebody from the Ku Klux Klan. By the way, ISIS figured this out before anybody else. And they use this as one of their main recruiting tools, the YouTube videos, because you could start off with a very sort of common sense sort of approach to certain, sort of the obvious, terrible issues, and you just keep making it more and more radical over time. So it's very difficult for us to conquer this particular challenge. And so this has all led to this hysteria we now have of the fake news invasion. The world is, coming to an end. Fake news is growing worse because, as sort of discussed just now, we have the new technologies make it easy to create and spread widely. The news business is in trouble. The model that we've used for 100 years is not working so well because advertising is not as profitable as it was for magazines. I worked for Time Magazine for 24 years. When I left in 2002, we were probably making $100 million a year in profit from, mostly from advertising. You could buy Time Magazine now for about $5 million. The whole thing, not one copy, but the whole thing, because there's no advertising. And nobody's figured out how to get consumers. Anyway, so fake news uses that because news sites, news organizations are desperate to keep you there as well. It's a commodity. Who's from Macedonia? Yeah. Right? You have these teenagers who made a living.
It's a business model, yeah.
Yeah, it's a great business model. And these teenagers, they weren't doing anti-Hillary stuff, pro-Trump. They weren't ideological. They tried doing anti-Trump stuff, but it didn't sell. They made more money, right? So it's a commodity. And then and it's hard to tell, is it the chicken or the egg? Are we more partisan because of all this misinformation, or is there all this misinformation because we were, but it certainly feeds on itself, because you only watch Fox and she only watches MSNBC, and you now therefore cannot even agree on what the terms of the debate are. Societies are being split very, very radically. Okay, all that said, fake news, we need to stop using it because fake news has become like a code word. So if somebody writes an article about news literacy that says it's a bunch of baloney, I'll say, well, that's just fake news. We now disregard everything that we disagree with by saying, oh, it must be fake news. That's certainly what Donald Trump does. So let's just quickly go over what is not fake news. Fake news is not when news changes, right? Sometimes scientists find out more things. So we talk in the course about provisional truth. So that's not fake news. It's just that, news isn't always right. News changes over time. It's not fake news when somebody makes a mistake. So this was CNN about 6 or 7 years ago, and this was supposed to be Osama. But one of the editors made a mistake, wrote, "Where's Obama?" And a lot of people said, aha, CNN is anti-Obama, because they're trying to, no, it was just somebody made a mistake. So that stuff happens all the time. This, by the way, is fake news. And this is a very common meme out there, which is, supposedly Trump in 1998 told People magazine, if I were going to run for president, I'd run as a Republican because Republicans are stupid. And I could fool them, roughly. He never said that. Never. But you all want to believe it, right? Right? And that's the power of fake news. It's plausible, and you want to believe it. Anyway, so, oh yeah, also, we've had fake news since the beginning of time. This is from a New York newspaper in 1835, one of the first profitable newspapers in America. And in order to increase sales, they ran a hoax on the front page that somebody had a new telescope in South Africa that made it possible to see the inhabitants of the moon. And these are pictures that they drew, and this increased their circulation a lot. Of course, it was before telegraph, so it took a long time to debunk this story. And so, by the way, what did their competitors do? Did their competitors write stories about how bad this was? No.
No, they use
No,
this.
they did the same thing.
The same.
Make money. Anyway, so we can talk about this separately or in depth at some later point, but I highly recommend to you something that was done by a researcher by the name of Claire Wardle for First Draft News. This was also in a report that was published by the European Union of Journalists, I think, in London late last year. And what she's done is she's also trying to get us to stop using the term fake news. And so she talks about misinformation and disinformation and the different kinds that there are and how we need to be more aware. Because sometimes satire or parody, it's not news, it's not real. It's not really disinformation, it's more misinformation. And it's meant, the objective is to make you, right? It's not to convince you otherwise. Sometimes people get confused though. So I'm sure you've heard of this. We have a satirical publication in America called The Onion, and invariably, at least 2 or 3 times a year, some newspaper, some news organization somewhere in the world will pick up an Onion headline and run it like it's real. So like the People's Daily in China picked up an Onion headline this was like 2 years ago, that Kim Jong-un was voted one of the 10 sexiest people on the planet. It was satire, but people don't always get that. Anyway, so this is all.
Sorry, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
What's the difference between misinformation and disinformation?
So misinformation is not meant to mislead. It's just not accurate. Disinformation is actively, it's like propaganda. Propaganda is disinformation. They are trying to make you look at the world in a certain way.
Okay.
So manipulated content, that's disinformation. False context, a lot of these are fabricated. Like the Macedonians, they were doing disinformation because they were trying to get people to look at more of their stuff. Right? So misinformation, think of misinformation as a mistake, or and it could be a mistake by the person who's creating it or the person who's consuming it. So for satire is misinformation, both because it's different, it's wrong, but also because it's only misinformation, though, if you don't realize that. If you know it's satire, then it's not misinformation. By the way, please, stop me at any moment. And here you can see, this is the misinformation, disinformation matrix. Anyway, it's really, I'll share the link with you later. It's really worth spending some time with. One of the hopes people have had over the last decade or so was that young people would naturally be able to spot misinformation and disinformation because they've grown up with phones and computers and that sort of thing. It turns out not to be true. They're just as clueless as everybody else. There's a group at Stanford that has done some really interesting work developing rubrics to try to determine how well people can sort out misinformation from accurate information. And this is one of the tests. These are supposedly daisies that were found near the Fukushima nuclear power plant, which, as you may remember, blew up 5 years ago, 10 years ago.
7.
Huh?
7.
See, between 5 and 10 is so much.
Exactly.
And they showed this to like a bunch of 12-year-olds, and very few of them spotted that it was obviously a Photoshop, right? This has just been Photoshop. Because, we're all taught from, this high that nuclear power is bad and it's dangerous and all this other stuff. So they're sort of primed to reject it. But it's not just it's not just 12-year-olds. The Stanford group, they tested 12-year-olds, 16-year-olds, 20-year-olds, 24-year-olds, university professors, postdocs. Nobody is any good at this. Mostly because of, our biases, our preferences. But we just aren't equipped. We're just not equipped to understand at first glance what is reliable and what isn't. Now, when I say we, I'm basically not really talking about people in this room. And I'm not talking about probably a lot of your friends. Most people who have succeeded in life, especially in information world, journalists, academia, whatever, you've internalized all of this ability to spot these sorts of things. You've got the Germans call it the Spitzengefühl, you can kind of smell it. You get a little alarm bell rings when you see something like this. But that doesn't mean we're perfect either. But it really, it affects everybody. And so everybody, I'm sure some of you are journalists or work with journalistic organizations, and there's a lot of money out there now for training journalists, news integrity initiatives, all this stuff. Oh, that's how we're going to stop fake news. We're going to have better journalists. Well, there's also a lot of money going into better algorithms. We've already discussed how likely that is to succeed.
But on this that you said I'd like just to relate to the thing that you said that young people can, let's say, notice easier when something is false. Like, there is a page on Facebook in Kosovo, and then it clearly explains that it's just satire, so that's not true. But people who are older, they tend to believe it all the time, whereas the young ones know that this is not true. So what people did, some politicians in elections, they also paid because they saw that a lot of people are going to this page and they didn't know that they were being laughed at because then this page would post things and kind of satire, laugh in a way, and they didn't know, and then they paid a lot, and then later on they understood that this is not something real, so then they said I don't want to, let's say, advertise myself there anymore, because now I understood that that's not something true, that's a satire.
Right. Yeah, I mean, we can discuss whether or not how much this applies to younger people, but it may just be young people who've already been told by other, they were in on the joke from the beginning. But if they had just encountered it without knowing any of the context, they might not have been any better than older people. I don't know. I mean, that's, but all I'm saying is the research that we've seen so far is that it doesn't seem to make that much difference. But none of this stuff works. None of these supply side things have worked. Better journalism isn't going to work if people don't know how to recognize better journalism. If people are uneducated about what good journalism looks like, how are they supposed to tell the difference between when somebody does a better job? This course, News Literacy, was originally created well before any of this happened. It started about 10 or 12 years ago. Rafal, were you gonna say 11? Anyway,
It was 2007 when you started, right?
exactly. We've been doing this for a while. Anyway, it was originally created by my dean, who had started a new journalism school because he said there was no point in training quality journalists if nobody knew what quality journalism looked like. And spending a lot of money helping newspaper reporters be better is useful, but it's not going to solve this problem. And the algorithms, and that's not going to solve the problem either. And even a lot of training in sort of news literacy or media literacy things. Ukraine had a thing called Learn to Discern. Who's here from Ukraine? So did you Learn to Discern, this IREX program, people to have meetings with lots of citizens, and they would show them ways of spotting fake news. And anyway, they spent a lot of time, a lot of money on this, and at the end of it, they did an assessment, and people who'd gone through the program could spot fake news like 66% of the time. Well, people who didn't go through the program could spot it 58% of the time. So it's kind of a rounding error at that point. And even the people who ran the program said the worst thing was it didn't help people go out and find reliable information. It just made them more skeptical about all information. And that, by the way, is the greatest danger of what we do. The thing I worry about, the thing that keeps me awake at night, is teaching news literacy in a way that people say, oh, it's all fake. I can, because I can go through any story in the best newspaper, best news organization in the world and find mistakes. It's easy. How do you motivate people and enable people to find reliable information? That's the challenge. Not to reject false information, but to find reliable information. So that's why we view news literacy as a demand-side solution. Let's get the consumers, the citizens, to demand better information. By the way, if you demand better information, news organizations will provide it. They're not stupid. They're trying to make money. They're trying to keep you. So if you say, I'm not going to look at this newspaper anymore because it's no good, and all of a sudden their readership drops. BuzzFeed, and you ever look at BuzzFeed?
Yeah.
Well, BuzzFeed, when it started, was just a bunch of listicles. 10 reasons your boyfriend's going to leave you. 10 things not to do in post night. And over the last 3 or 4 years, they've become a pretty good news organization. And I think it's partially because of consumer demand. Anyway, so we think that what's needed is a new literacy for the 21st century. Just as people had to learn to read and write after Gutenberg, after Zuckerberg, they need to learn to look at information in a different way. And so our course is designed to try to help people look at information in a different way. The guy who ran the Stanford study, he calls it, instead of reading vertically, we need to start reading laterally or horizontally. You see a story, and it quotes Richard Hornick of Stony Brook University. You need to go into another tab, Google me, right? I mean, it takes time, and you can't do it for every story, but it's the sort of reaction we want people to have. So, interrogate information, verify it, reject rank and popularity. Basically, the algorithms are designed not to give you the most reliable information, but just the most popular information. So if you Google Martin Luther King Jr. in the United States, one of the top 5 or 6 results will turn out to be a web page that was created by the Ku Klux Klan. And it looks pretty, reasonable. And again, this is the tough one. Acknowledging we're most most of the problem. So this is our, I mean, so this, some of this stuff is, you will have gotten in the pre-course. One way of looking at the course is to think of it in these 4 questions. So what am I looking at? Where is this information coming from? What's its origin? What do I really know? After reading something or watching something, what do I know? What do they tell me that I know? Not that I think or might be, but what do I know? And then, how do I know that? Why do I think that I know this? What was the quality of the evidence that was provided? How good were the sources? They quote Richard Hornick from Stony Brook University about news literacy. Well, I might be pretty good on that, but if they're, quoting me about the Fukushima nuclear disaster, even though I'm a professor at a famous American science university, all you have to do is look at my background and know that I would be next to worthless as a source for that, right? We'll talk about that tomorrow. And then, one of the things we really like to do with the students is to empower them by getting them to say what they would like to know after reading a story. If they were doing the story, who would they have talked to? What would they have asked? What are the questions? What don't I know? What haven't they told me that I'd like to know, that I think is important? This is a way of thinking about the course as well. We've talked about this a little bit over the years. One of the biggest problems is that there's just too much material. I mean, in some ways, we try to do in one semester what should be done over the course of, starting in middle school or high school or something like that, gradually over time. So one of the things you have to grapple with if you're trying to do something, if you want to do a little radio podcast or whatever, is figure out what can you comfortably accomplish. Pick amongst these. You're not going to be able to do the whole thing unless you teach the course the way we teach it, and that's a lot of work. And you also need a lot of support from your university or whatever. So, and we'll, when your presentations on Thursday will focus on this. Pick something that you think would be particularly useful in your environment. Pick 1 or 2 or 3 of these things that you think, that would be a big help. If people would just start doing X, that would be a big help. So we'll go through this, even though, again, I'll go through this quickly because you've had it in the pre-training. But so one of the things we try to do is get people to focus on: is it news? Is it journalism? Or is it some fake thing? So and you can, you can tell it. We're just trying to provide students with some helpful, hints. So, can you see that the whoever has written this has tried to verify the information? Are there, quotes from experts? Is there direct evidence? What have they done? Not just giving you their opinion, but giving you verified information. Are they primarily responsible to the reader or to someone else? And lots of information. Are they accountable? Do they tell you who they are? Are they honest about who they are? Are they honest that it was a satirical website? Does it say at the top, this is a satirical? A lot of The Onion makes no bones about the fact that it's satirical. They're quite, they're accountable. And if they make a mistake, they'll admit they make a mistake. right? So just not paying attention to anonymous information or information from people with fake names, you can get rid of 90% of the garbage that's out there. Because most of it is being forwarded by people who don't want you to know who they are, or they pretend to be somebody else. Anyway, this, you could spend a whole course talking about this here. Impartiality, is there such thing as impartiality? Objectivity, of course, we all know objectivity is possible, but how close can you come? A good journalist, and this is something we demand of our information providers, at least make the effort to set aside their prejudices. They're not, and again, 90% of the time you can see that people, they're not even pretending to be fair. They're not even pretending to try. Well, how good is that? I mean, I used to tell my students that, if you have two friends who are having a fight, and you talk to her first, and then her, would you then tell another friend just her side of the story? No, of course not, because people never tell you the truth, they just tell you their point of view, right? So if you see an information site that makes no effort to present the other side, that should be a red flag. That should be something that just to, all we want is for people to have a little alarm bell go off in their brain when they see something that's meant to be misleading. And then accountability. Just taking responsibility for the effort. So we spend a lot of time, maybe too much time in our course, going over these different information neighborhoods, when in fact the only thing that you really need to get across is what is journalism. Because journalism is the only one where all three of these are present. So, for example, you can have in publicity or advertising, you can have verification. Most big companies are not going to lie in an ad. They're just not going to tell you everything. They're going to tell you what's good about their product. They're not going to tell you what's bad about their product. So if you want to buy a new mobile phone, you don't just go to the Apple website and read what Apple has to say about it. You maybe go to other phones, but you also go to CNET or some website where they have people who are independent, accountable, and who have done some research. And you base your decision on that, right? So advertising, it can be verified, but it's not independent. Just think about independence as, are they going to tell me something? Are they only going to give me their side of the story? And so advertising can be verified. It is accountable because you know who they are. But it's missing this third thing. And by the way, there is reliable information in advertising. In all of these, propaganda has sort of gotten a bad name in English anyway. It's got a very negative connotation, whereas, traditionally propaganda is, can be public service announcements, that can be considered to be propaganda, right? That you should get vaccinated, you should, whatever, wash your hands. That's all propaganda, but it's not always bad. So there is reliable information in all of these, but it's limited. Journalism, when done well, is the most reliable, at least in our scheme. And as I mentioned earlier on this authenticity issue, basically everybody is trying to borrow that credibility of journalism by looking like it. So advertising now is trying to look like news because nobody will look at it otherwise. There's a wonderful, have any of you seen this guy, John Oliver? He's an American, he's a British comedian. He's on American television, HBO, and he does a news show every Sunday night. And he did a wonderful, and if we have time, maybe we can show it later. He did a wonderful segment on native advertising and why, and sponsored content, and why people use it. And it's basically because the news business is going, is running out of money, and and nobody ever clicks on a banner ad, right? I mean, nobody, you see all these ads, and every time you pull up a page, when was the last time you actually clicked on one of those stupid ads? I'm always just looking for that little X in the top right of the box so I can get rid of it, right? And if you miss the X, then, the ad pops up, and right? Anyway. Oh, there it is. So then, again, very basic common sense. Who says? Says who? First question you should always ask. Who is this person? Why are they telling you this? What's going on here? And that's where we have this mnemonic that we've developed, and it's not rocket science. It's common sense, but it can be a very useful tool, especially for young students, as a kind of, I don't want to say crutch, but aid. Something that they, just ask themselves if they're reading, is the person who's being quoted in the story, telling me the whole truth or just their side of it? Are there other people who are saying, especially if it's controversial, are there other people who are saying similar things? We actually, we've decided, and we began to try to change this because this can get confusing from time to time. We don't have to get it into now, but basically what we're talking about here is the person who is quoted in the story is what they say supported or corroborated by other information in the story. Are there other people saying that? Is there evidence that supports it? Or is it just one person saying this one thing that's completely different from everybody else? People who tell you what they know as opposed to what they think, much more useful. Right? I know that Rafal was late today because I saw him enter the classroom at 9:30. Or, I don't know for sure, but, Rafal is always late. I'll bet you $100. That's an assertion. And you hear that all the time. And people make these assertions, these statements, that are not supported in fact or observation. And then, again, very common sense. I used this before. If I'm talking in a story, if I'm quoted on news literacy or journalism issues, then I'm authoritative. I know something about what I'm talking about. If I'm asked, if I'm talking about a nuclear power plant, I'm not authoritative. What am I doing in the story? And that sounds funny, but lots of journalists use quotes from people who are not very authoritative. Especially on television, you see these people, man on the street, Vox Pop interviews. They're complete, sorry for any TV journalists here, but they're a joke. They're just filler. Those people don't know what they're talking about. And then, again, common sense. Somebody who's named is going to be more reliable than somebody who isn't named. And my students are always very good about this. So I'll ask you the question. Why? What's wrong with an unnamed source? What's the biggest problem as a consumer you face when you see an unnamed source?
Because we don't know who to ask our question to get detailed information, or if we have some suspects.
But there's no one responsible for the information.
Yeah.
Even more basic.
You don't know if it's true.
What's the biggest problem with an anonymous source from the point of view of a consumer, reader?
You don't know who those sources and whether they're reliable.
Yeah.
Or whether
They're
Reliable.
they exist?
They're real.
Yeah.
How the hell do you know? A senior diplomat said. Which Which one? Who?
Yeah.
Many economists say. Name one. How about many? Is that 2 or 3 or 5 or 12? Those should be little alarm bells that will, go bing. Maybe not. And we have some pretty good rules about how to judge the reliability of unnamed sources, because a lot of reporting requires that. But it's given us some idea of who they are, so we know, how they would know what they say they know. And then I mentioned this earlier. So our final exam at Stony Brook for this we teach this as a 42-hour 3-credit course, a lecture and a tutorial every week, 80 minutes. And the final exam is entirely open book, because we give students news articles, videos, radio things, social media posts, and they have to deconstruct. They have to say how reliable they are, and we don't. They basically, I tell them if they have to use a book, if they can take in all the slides, they can take whatever they want, because if they have to do that, they're not going to have time to pass the test. Right? They need to have internalized this. This is not a course. I always start off every semester by telling my students that this is not a course I would have done well in when I was their age, because I never studied for an exam until the last possible minute. Not a great way to go through college, but anyway, it's maybe why I wound up being a journalist, and I only work well on deadline. Anyway, and then we want it, and then it shouldn't be some sort of abstract thing. It needs to be, can you take an action? And one of the actions is, should you forward it? Should you share this with other people? Every time before you share information, you should ask, is it reliable? I'm taking ownership. So, everybody know Spider-Man? Okay. Everybody, what did Uncle Ben say to Peter Parker?
About responsibility?
With great power comes great responsibility. Our students are the most powerful generation in the history of mankind. Every one of them has a TV station in their pocket. I was talking about Gutenberg democratizing the spread of the consumption of information. This revolution has democratized the spread. Everybody now is a publisher. Everybody produces information. That was not true 25 years ago. 20 years ago, I was one of the most powerful people in the world. I was an editor for Time magazine. I decided what you read. If you read Time magazine, I was one of 5 or 6 people who determined what 5 or 6 million people would read every week. That was my power. That is gone. That's vaporized. That power is now completely democratized. So, when I was making those decisions, I felt a great deal of responsibility. I didn't want to screw up. You're always fighting over what stories get published, which ones don't. And you're always trying to make sure that you're accurate. So most people, when they're sitting at doing Twitter or Facebook or something, they're not thinking, oh gee, this is really important. I better make sure that this is not bogus information. Oh, this is kind of funny. And a lot of people who share fake news know that it's fake news. They just think it's humorous, or it'll piss off some friend of theirs or something. So we need to take a different approach to this. So so basically, and again, different people will use this material differently. Originally, when we started spreading this course, we were trying to get everybody to teach it more or less like we do. We gave up on it. It's a lot of work, and and it may not be necessarily appropriate to do it in for college. Anyway, I said before, one of the most, but I do think this is important. We always try to exploit student deficits. We give students challenges, help them try to make some decisions, and then discuss why they made those decisions. We don't just present information, say, here, do this. A lot of time coming up with new examples. We need a lot of video. If you got an 80-minute lecture with a bunch of 18-year-olds at 8 o'clock in the morning, you got to keep them awake. So we're always